Prophets didn't just pray, they had a practice, a technology for hearing the divine, and it works for you too. That sentence is not poetry. That sentence is not a metaphor. That sentence is an invitation, and I want you to sit with it for just a moment before we go any further. Because if you have been walking around this earth feeling like God has gone quiet, like the frequency you were once tuned to suddenly went dark, what I am about to share with you today could change the entire architecture of your spiritual life. Not eventually, not maybe. Today, there is a reason prophets heard things other people could not hear. There is a reason some people walk into a room and seem to carry a weight of knowing. A quiet authority that has nothing to do with their education or their status or their circumstances. They are not special in the way we often think of special. They are practiced, they are trained, they are people who learned long ago how to quiet the noise inside themselves long enough to hear the frequency that never stopped broadcasting. That frequency is still on, right now. As you watch this, the voice of God did not retire. The channel is open. The signal is clear. You just may not know how to tune your instrument anymore. And this video is going to change that. Before we go any further, if this is already landing somewhere real inside you, I want you to do something right now. Click like on this video. Write in the comments the words, "I am ready to listen," not as a performance, but as a declaration, an act of the will, a turning of the ear. I am ready to listen. Because something shifts in you when you say it out loud. Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. Because what we are going to be building together in the weeks ahead is a curriculum of the ancient, a return to practices that the modern world has largely forgotten. And you do not want to miss a single moment of it. Now, let me tell you who I am, and why I believe I have earned the right to speak to you about this. My name is Thomas, and I have been studying the intersection of ancient wisdom and modern spiritual practice for over 30 years. I am not a television preacher. I am not a motivational speaker with a Bible verse in my pocket. I am a teacher, a student, a person who became so hungry for the voice of God in my own life at a time when I was convinced God had entirely stopped speaking, that I went back, all the way back, into the ancient Hebrew text, into the practices of the prophets, into the original disciplines that the people of Scripture used not as supplements to their spiritual lives, but as the very mechanism by which they tuned into the divine. What I found in those years of searching did not just answer my questions. It dismantled them entirely and replaced them with something far more alive. And I want to give it to you today. But first, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. Even if the answer makes you uncomfortable. Are you tired of praying into what feels like a ceiling? Have you read the same scriptures over and over and walked away with nothing but the sound of your own thoughts bouncing back at you? Do you feel like there is a conversation happening somewhere just beyond the edge of your hearing? And no matter how hard you strain, you cannot quite catch the words. If you said yes to even one of those questions, you are not failing. You are not faithless. You are not abandoned. You are simply operating without the ancient technology that your spiritual ancestors used every single day. And once you learn it, everything changes. Let me paint you a picture of where we are right now. We live in the loudest moment in human history. Not loud in the way a thunderstorm is loud, with a single, overwhelming sound that demands your full attention. Loud in the way 1,000 voices in 1,000 rooms all speaking at once is loud. The relentless scroll of content, the notifications, the opinions, the commentary, The noise inside your own head that by 3 in the morning has become so thick you cannot find the floor of your own thoughts. You know this feeling. You have lain awake in the dark with your chest heavy and your mind racing. And you have reached for something solid, something true, and found only more noise. You have sat in church and watched other people experience what looks like genuine connection, and felt a quiet shame that you could not name because the ceiling of your own prayer felt so low, so hard, so impermeable. You have sat in the car after dropping the kids off and had 30 seconds of absolute stillness and thought, I should pray. I should listen. I want to hear. And then your phone buzzed and the moment dissolved and you promised yourself you would get to it later. Later never arrived. The accumulation of all those dissolved moments has left you, over months and years, with a prayer life that feels more like a list than a conversation, more like a negotiation than a relationship, more like a performance for an audience that may or may not be present than a genuine meeting between two souls who know each other. You have wondered whether God speaks to some people and not to others, whether there is a chosen circle of the spiritually gifted who simply receive transmissions you are not on the list to receive, whether your very real, very sincere desire to hear God is somehow not enough, not clean enough, not holy enough. I want to dismantle that lie right now, completely, because it is a lie. The ancient record does not show us a God who played favorites with his voice. It shows us a God who spoke to shepherds and farmers, to fugitives hiding in desert caves, to young boys sleeping in the temple in the middle of the night. What those people had in common was not perfection. It was not status. It was not even extraordinary faith in the moment of contact. What they had was a practice, a posture, a prepared interior landscape in which the voice of God could land. This is what we are going to rebuild today. Now I need to take you back, not to a comfortable Bible story, but to a radical moment in ancient Hebrew spiritual practice. Because this is where the technology actually lives. Consider the Hebrew word Shema. If you have any familiarity with Jewish tradition, you have heard this word. It is the first word of the most foundational declaration in all of Judaism, taken from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God. The Lord is one. But here is what most people never learn about this word. Shema does not simply mean to hear in the passive sense, the way you might hear traffic outside your window without attending to it. The Hebrew word Shema carries within it a full theology of reception. It means to hear with the intention of responding, to hear with the entire self, not just the ear, to allow what is spoken to penetrate deeply enough that it produces action, transformation, obedience. In Hebrew, to truly hear is to truly do. This is not a linguistic curiosity. This is the entire architecture of the ancient prophetic practice. The prophets did not merely wait for a vision to arrive while going about their ordinary lives. They actively constructed the interior conditions that made hearing possible. They created, day after day, a landscape of deep attentiveness inside themselves. And then they entered it deliberately, the way a musician enters a practice room. And in that prepared interior space, the voice of God found them. What does that interior landscape look like? What were the actual practices? This is where we go deep today. Because I am going to give you not theory, but method. The first practice is what ancient Hebrew scripture calls Haggah. This word appears in Joshua chapter 1, verse 8. where God speaks to Joshua at the threshold of the promised land and says this book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. The word translated meditate in that verse is Haggah, and it does not mean what modern audiences typically picture when they hear the word meditation. It does not mean sitting in silence with your eyes closed trying to empty your thoughts. The Hebrew root of Haggah carries the image of murmuring, of low, continuous, almost inaudible speech. It is the sound a dove makes. It is the sound of a person who is so saturated with a word that the word begins to move through them without effort. The way breathing moves through the body, think about what that means. The ancient Hebrews, the prophets, the leaders of Israel, did not merely read the scripture, they inhabited it. They carried it in their mouths throughout the day, not as recitation, not as performance, but as a continuous, almost subconscious murmuring of truth into their own interior world. And over time, that world became so saturated with the voice of God already recorded in Scripture that their spirits became attuned, like a tuning fork that begins to vibrate in the presence of the right frequency. This is the first practice, and we are going to come back to exactly how you do it. But let me take you now to a story that I believe is one of the most misread moments in all of Scripture, because it is actually a masterclass in prophetic listening. The prophet Elijah, a man who had just called down fire from heaven on Mount Carmel, who had confronted an entire corrupt religious system with his bare hands and the power of the living God, who had stood alone against 450 prophets of Baal and won. By any spiritual metric you want to use, Elijah was operating at the highest altitude of prophetic authority. And then, immediately after the greatest victory of his life, he collapses, he runs into the wilderness, he sits down under a tree and asks to die. And in this broken, depleted, utterly human moment, God comes to him. But listen very carefully to how God does not come. According to 1 Kings chapter 19, the Lord passes by, and there comes a great and powerful wind, the kind that tears the mountains apart and shatters rocks. But the Lord is not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord is not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord is not in the fire. And after the fire, a still, small voice. Stop right there. Read it again. Not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, in the silence after. Do you understand what this means for your life right now? You have been waiting for the earthquake. You have been listening for the wind. You have been looking for the fire. The dramatic sign, the unmistakable interruption of your ordinary life that proves beyond all doubt that God is real and speaking and near. But the ancient record says that was never where the voice lived. The voice lives in the afterward. The voice lives in the space you create when you stop adding more noise to your already noise-saturated life and go quiet enough to catch the low murmur that has been running beneath everything all along. Elijah wrapped his face in his mantle and went to the entrance of the cave. And a voice said to him, "What are you doing here?" Elijah, not a theological treatise, not a doctrinal download, just a question, intimate, personal, direct. "What are you doing here?" God spoke to the broken man, the same way God speaks to you in your most honest moments. Simply, quietly, with a question that opens a door. This is the second practice, and it is one you may have overlooked entirely. The practice of sacred positioning, Elijah did not accidentally end up at the cave. He was led there, step by step, through a series of small, obedient movements. An angel touched him while he slept. Get up and eat. He got up and ate. The journey is too great for you. He lay down again. He was touched a second time. Get up and eat, for the journey is too great. He got up and ate and drank and was sustained for 40 days on that nourishment. Every step was preparation. Every act of simple obedience was a movement toward the place where he would hear. And when he arrived at the cave, he went in and spent the night. He created stillness. He created shelter. He created a physical and interior space that was removed from the chaos of his circumstances. And in that space, the voice found him. This is what sacred positioning means. It is the deliberate act of creating the conditions, the physical space, the time, the stillness, in which you are accessible to God. Not but because you require it to hear. Most of us are trying to have the kind of conversations that require stillness while standing in the middle of a hurricane. We are asking for depth while skimming the surface. We are expecting intimacy while never slowing down long enough to be known. A conversation requires two parties who are both present. And presence, real presence, the kind that can actually receive what is being given, requires the deliberate decision to stop doing something else. Elijah stopped running. He stopped managing his fear. He stopped trying to solve the problem of Jezebel. He stopped explaining himself and defending his track record to himself in the wilderness dark. He lay down in the shelter, ate the bread that arrived beside him, and rested. And in the resting, in the actual surrender of trying to hold everything together through effort, the journey became possible. And at the end of the journey, the voice was waiting. Are you genuinely creating sacred positions in your life right now? Or are you trying to hear God while simultaneously managing your phone, your anxiety, your to-do list, and the noise of everything that has not gone the way you needed it to go? Are you giving God the courtesy of your undivided attention, even for 10 uninterrupted minutes a day? Have you ever wondered whether the silence you are afraid to enter is actually the very place where everything you have been searching for is waiting? I want to speak to the person who is watching this right now and has not been in that kind of silence in years, maybe decades. Not because you are lazy, not because you are faithless, but because the noise has been so relentless, and the grief has been so constant, and the demands of your life have been so consuming that the idea of sitting in genuine quiet feels less like peace and more like danger. Because when everything goes silent, the things you have been running from finally have a chance to catch up. I hear you. I see you. And I want to tell you something that the ancient text confirms over and over again. God is not afraid of what is waiting in your silence. God is not frightened by your grief, your doubt, your anger, in your exhaustion. God enters those spaces. That is precisely where the voice shows up, not in the triumphant moment on the mountaintop. In the cave, after the fire, you are not too broken to be spoken to. You are simply too noisy to hear. Now let me take you to the third practice. And this one comes from a story that many people know but almost nobody examines closely enough. The boy Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 3. The Bible tells us that in those days the word of the Lord was rare. There was no frequent vision. Let that land for a moment. There was a time, even in the history of the people of God, when divine communication had become scarce, not because God had withdrawn, but because the spiritual infrastructure for receiving had collapsed. The priests were corrupt, The practices had been abandoned. The sacred attentiveness had been replaced by religious performance. By going through the motions of a tradition that had lost its living connection. Sound familiar? And into that environment of spiritual scarcity, God chooses to speak to a child, to a boy who does not yet even know the Lord in the covenantal sense, who has grown up in the temple but has not had a direct encounter with the divine voice. And God calls his name, Samuel, Samuel, and Samuel runs to Eli. He thinks it is his master calling him. 3 times the voice comes. 3 times Samuel misidentifies the source. And it is only when the old priest Eli, for all his failings, gives Samuel the ancient posture of reception that everything changes. Go, lie down, and if he calls you, say, speak. Lord, for your servant hears. Speak. Lord, for your servant hears. Pay attention to the next sentence. That is not just a prayer. That is a posture. It is the physical act of lying down, of making yourself still and low and available, combined with the verbal declaration of receptivity, combined with the identification of your own role, not as the one who initiates, not as the one who demands, but as the servant, the one who waits with the posture of someone ready to receive and to act on what is received. And the Lord came and stood and called as at other times. And Samuel answered, Speak, for your servant hears. And everything changed from that moment forward. This is the third practice. It is the posture of the willing listener. And it is different from simply saying you want to hear, because wanting to hear while maintaining your posture as the one in control, as the one who evaluates whether the message meets your expectations, as the one who decides whether to act on what is received. That is not the posture of a servant. That is the posture of a consumer. The ancient prophets were servants first. They came to the place of listening from below, not from above. They came empty-handed, without an agenda for what God should say, without a predetermined framework into which the divine word needed to fit. They came low, and in that lowness, they were filled. How often do you bring your own agenda to your quiet time? How often do you arrive at prayer already knowing what answer you are looking for? Already decided about which direction you want God to confirm? Already braced to reinterpret anything that does not match what you have already concluded? That is not sacred listening. That is looking for God to co-sign what you have already decided. The posture of Samuel is different. The posture of Samuel is, I am here. I am low. I am still. Speak. I will hear. I will act. Whatever you say. That posture is what the prophets had that most of us have traded for something smaller. Now I want to give you something practical. Because all of this wisdom, as beautiful as it is, means nothing if it does not translate into a practice you can actually do. Here is a 4-part framework, drawn directly from the ancient practices we have been examining, that you can begin using starting today. Not next week, not when things calm down. Today, the first step is preparation, and it corresponds to the practice of Haggah, the murmuring meditation of Scripture. Choose one passage, one verse, no more than 3 or 4 sentences of Scripture, and carry it with you through the day, not to analyze it, not to extract a theological point from it. Carry it the way you carry a song that gets lodged in your mind. Let it move through you low and quiet. Murmur it while you drive. Speak it softly while you wash dishes. Let it run beneath the surface of everything you do. You are not trying to understand it with your mind. You are saturating your spirit with it the way you saturate a cloth in water, until it is entirely absorbed. There is a reason the ancient command about the Shema in Deuteronomy chapter 6 says to speak of these words when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way and when you lie down and when you rise, morning and evening and every hour between. The entire rhythm of daily life was designed to keep the divine word moving through the practitioner continuously, not as a burden, as a breath. The second step is positioning. Create a sacred space and a sacred time that belongs entirely to listening, not to asking, not to interceding for others. As important as that is, specifically to listening, this does not need to be long. Begin with 10 minutes. A chair, a quiet room. No phone, no list. Just your body made still and your attention directed upward and inward. And say these words, or words very close to them. Speak, Lord, I am here. I am listening. I will hear. I will act. And then wait, in the silence, without filling it. I know how uncomfortable this is. I know the mind will immediately begin to generate its own content to fill the quiet. The anxious thoughts, the random memories, the mundane concerns, the question of whether you left the stove on. This is normal. Do not fight it. Notice it. Gently release your grip on those thoughts and return your attention to the posture of listening, again and again, as many times as needed. You are not failing when your mind wanders. You are practicing when you return. The third step is writing. After your time of listening, take 3 minutes to write down anything that came to you during the silence. Not because everything that comes during quiet time is a divine communication, but because the practice of writing creates a record over time, and over days and weeks and months of doing this faithfully, you will begin to see patterns emerge. You will begin to recognize a quality of thought, a tone, a texture, that is consistently different from the ordinary noise of your own mental chatter. Deeper, stiller, often surprising, often addressing things you did not directly ask about, often arriving as a question rather than an answer. The way God arrived at Elijah in the cave with, "What are you doing here?" Keep a journal. Not a prayer journal in the conventional sense, but a listening journal, a record of what you received, and review it at the end of each week. The fourth step is obedience. This one is the most critical and the most commonly skipped, because hearing is incomplete without acting. Remember, the Hebrew word Shema contains within it the full movement from perception to response to action. To truly hear is to truly do. Every time you receive something in your time of listening, however small, however quiet, however uncertain, act on it. Even if acting on it simply means sitting with it for the day. Even if acting on it means making one phone call you have been avoiding. Even if acting on it means writing a letter of forgiveness you have been postponing for years. The ancient record is consistent. Those who acted on what they heard were given more. Those who heard and did not act found the frequency gradually going quiet again. This is not punishment. It is physics. A muscle that is not used grows weak. An instrument that is never played falls out of tune. The faculty of divine listening is no different. It must be exercised to remain alive. Consider what happened to Samuel after that first night of listening. The text tells us that Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. That phrase is extraordinary. None of his words fell to the ground. Everything that Samuel spoke carried weight, carried landing, carried consequence. Because he was connected, because the channel was open and clear and regularly used, because he had built, starting in that one dark night of lying low and saying, "Speak," a lifelong practice of availability. And all of Israel, from one end to the other, knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord, not because he was born with a supernatural ability, not because he had a theological pedigree or a prestigious spiritual lineage, because he practiced, because he kept the posture, because every morning of his life he returned to the place of the servant and said again, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." That is available to you, starting today. I want to stay with this for a moment because I believe it is the place where most sincere, genuinely hungry people get stuck, not in the hearing, in the obeying, because the things God tends to speak about are precisely the things you already know, at some level, need to change. The relationship that is draining you of your sense of self, the habit that has become a hiding place, the conversation you have been postponing because it will require you to be vulnerable in a way that frightens you. The dream you have buried under so much practical objection that you have almost forgotten it was yours. God does not speak primarily about other people. God speaks primarily about you, about the interior geography of your own life. The places where fear has made you smaller than you were created to be. The places where pride has calcified around a wound. The places where hope has been quietly seeping away for so long you barely remember what it felt like when it was full. The voice speaks into those places first. And if you are not willing to let it, you will find every technique in the world for hearing God and remain, in effect, deaf. Not because God stopped speaking, because you have become fluent in the art of hearing without receiving. Be still and know that I am God. That is Psalm 46, verse 10. And it is one of the most misunderstood instructions in all of Scripture. Because the word translated "be still" in the original Hebrew carries the sense of letting go, of releasing your grip on the thing you are holding so tightly, of ceasing striving, of taking your hands off the wheel. Know that I am God. Not know about God. Know God. The kind of knowing that comes not from information but from presence. The kind of knowing that happens when you have been in the same room with something long enough that it begins to change you from the outside in. This is the entire goal of the ancient listening practices. Not information. Presence. Not answers. Encounter. Not a theological update. A living God who addresses you by name in your specific situation, in your specific cave at the end of your specific wilderness. And someone watching this right now knows exactly what I mean when I say that. You have been in the wilderness longer than you planned. You left something, or something was taken from you, and you ran for your life into the desert. And you have been there so long that you have started to wonder whether anyone noticed you were gone. You have sat under your own juniper tree and asked God to let it be enough. You have given everything you had and watched it seem to amount to nothing. And the voice of the enemy has been so persistent in your ear that you almost believed it when it said the silence proves you are alone. You are not alone. You are in the cave. And the wind and the earthquake and the fire are about to be followed by the voice, the still, small, personal, intimate, specific voice, the one that knows your name, the one that asks exactly the question you need to be asked, the one that, when you hear it, you will know beyond any doubt is not your own. There is someone watching right now who stopped pursuing the calling on their life because they stopped being able to hear confirmation of it. The dream is not dead. The calling was not revoked. The silence was a wilderness. And wilderness seasons always end. Your 7 steps of Haggah this week are the beginning of the journey back, not back to what was, but forward into what has been waiting. There is someone watching right now who is carrying a grief so heavy and so private that no one around them knows the full weight of it, and they have been afraid to bring it into the silence. Because silence has a way of making big things feel bigger. I want to speak to you specifically. The voice is not afraid of your grief. The voice does not require you to be composed before you are worthy of being addressed. Go into the cave with everything you are carrying. Go in, weighed down, the same voice that addressed a suicidal, burnt out, terrified Elijah in the wilderness after his greatest failure will address you. This is for you, the one who is watching this right now because something in you refuses to stop believing there is more. That refusal is itself a word. That hunger is already the voice. Honor it by practicing. Honor it by beginning today. This is for you. All of it. The one who went to church for years out of habit after the hunger left. The one who read the scripture dutifully but cannot remember the last time a word in it reached through the page and took hold of you. The one who is watching this video right now with a kind of cautious, almost embarrassed hope. Because you want this to be real. You want this to be true. But you have been disappointed before. And hope is a risk you are not sure you can afford again. I am speaking directly to you. The practices I have given you today are not my invention. They are not the product of a modern spiritual system or a motivational methodology. They are the tested, ancien, verified practices of the prophets of Israel, people who lived in difficult times, who faced impossible circumstances, who were often alone, often afraid, often in situations where the silence of God would have been a perfectly reasonable interpretation of their experience. And they chose, again and again, to prepare the interior landscape, to position themselves, to come low, to speak the words of Scripture through their own mouths until they became flesh, to wait, and to act on what they received. And they heard. You can hear, not eventually, not once you get your life in order, not once the grief lifts or the circumstances improve or you become somehow more worthy. The boy Samuel heard before he even knew the Lord. He heard because he was taught the posture. He heard because he was willing to say, "Speak, I am listening." That is the door. That is the only door. Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. And then actually becoming the servant, actually doing the hearing, actually moving in the direction of what is received. Let me give you a practical schedule to begin with. Not a program, not a challenge, a beginning. For the first 7 days, do this every morning before you open your phone, before you speak to anyone, before the noise of the world enters your interior space. Choose one verse. It does not need to be complicated. Psalm 46, verse 10 is a perfect beginning. Be still and know that I am God. Carry it through the morning, murmuring it, letting it run beneath your thoughts. This is your Haggah. This is your saturation practice. At some point during the day, find 10 minutes. Set a timer if you need to. Go somewhere quiet, or as quiet as your life allows. Sit low. Say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." And wait. For the full 10 minutes, do not fill the silence with requests. Just wait. Write down whatever came to you afterward. Even if it seems small, even if it seems like your own thought, write it down anyway. At the end of the 7 days, Read back through your journal. Notice what has been consistent. Notice what surprised you. Notice whether there is a thread running through the week, a quiet word, a repeated impression, a direction your attention kept returning to. That thread is not an accident. Now, I want to bring you back to the beginning of this teaching, because there is something I said at the start that I want to land with full weight. Prophets didn't just pray, they had a practice, a technology for hearing the divine, and it works for you too. I use the word technology intentionally, because a technology is not a gift available only to a special class of people. A technology is a repeatable method that produces consistent results when applied correctly. The ancient listening practices I have described today are exactly that. They are not mystical in the sense of being inaccessible. They are not reserved for monks or scholars or people with theological degrees or people who have achieved some level of spiritual maturity that you have not yet reached. They are for you. They were always for you. The fact that modernity stripped them out of the spiritual formation of ordinary believers is one of the great losses of the last 200 years. And I believe, with everything in me, that one of the central movements of the Spirit in this generation is a recovery of the ancient practices, going back in order to go forward, a return to the well that never went dry, even when people stop visiting it. Think about what has been lost and what is being reclaimed. Somewhere along the way, the spiritual formation of ordinary Christians became primarily informational. We teach people what to believe, what the doctrines are, what the creeds say, what the correct positions are on contested theological questions, and those things have their place. But we stopped teaching people how to be with God. We stopped equipping people with the interior disciplines that create the conditions for encounter. We gave people a full theological library and forgot to teach them how to open the door. The ancient practitioners knew something we have nearly forgotten, that knowledge about God and knowledge of God are not the same thing. That you can fill a notebook with correct doctrine and still live your entire life without ever truly being addressed by the living God in a way that changes you from the inside out. And that the bridge between those two realities is not more information, it is practice, posture, patience, the willingness to return day after day to the place of the servant and say again what Samuel said, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." That is all it takes to start. That is the oldest door there is, and it has never once been locked. I want to be very direct about that. You are navigating a landscape of 1,000 other things to click on, 1,000 other rabbit holes to fall into, and something, some pull, some quiet but persistent urging, brought you here, to this teaching, to these ancient practices, to this moment of hearing that hearing is possible. That is not coincidence. That is already the voice. Pay attention to it. The ancient masters did not teach that divine communication was a rare, miraculous event reserved for spiritual giants. They taught that it was the natural state of a prepared, attentive, humble human soul. That the silence of God in many people's experience was not divine absence, but the noise level of the human life having risen above the frequency of the divine communication, that the solution was not to wait for God to shout louder, but to learn, through practice and discipline and the slow stripping away of interior noise, to hear at the frequency where God actually speaks, which is quiet, which is still, which is after the fire. I want to speak one more time to the person who is the hardest to reach with this message. The one who has done everything right, who has been faithful, who has served, who has sacrificed, who has poured themselves into their family, their community, their church, and who now sits in a kind of bewildered exhaustion, wondering where the aliveness went, wondering when the practice became obligation, wondering why the God they once knew with such immediacy now feels like a figure from a distant chapter of their own history. You have not been abandoned. What has happened is something the ancient text actually names. You became so busy doing the works of God that you stopped being with God. The sacred positioning fell away first, then the Haggah, then the posture of the willing listener, until what remained was a very capable, very busy, very religious exterior with a hungry interior. And the hunger did not go away. It just went quiet, because you convinced yourself that hunger was the price of maturity. It is not. The hunger is a signal. The hunger is the pull. The hunger is the voice saying, through the medium of your own unmet longing, come back to the cave. Come back to the morning quiet. Come back to the 10 minutes with the door closed and the phone face down, and the first words on your lips being not a request but a surrender. Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. Come back. The ancient practices are waiting. The frequency is still on. The channel is open. And the voice that has known your name since before you had one is still speaking into the still, small interior of the life you are living right now. You just need to learn, again, how to hear it. Begin today. With one verse in your mouth, with 10 minutes of sacred positioning, with a journal open beside you, with the words, speak, Lord, for your servant hears. That is all it takes to start. That is the oldest door there is. And it has never once been locked. And I want to add one more thing before we close, because I have been building toward this and I do not want to leave it unsaid. The ancient practices are not a formula. They are not a system you master and then apply. They are a relationship you deepen. Every practitioner of the ancient listening arts will tell you the same thing. The longer you do this, the less predictable it becomes. The voice does not settle into a comfortable pattern that you can anticipate and manage. It remains surprising. It remains uncontrollable. It retains the right to say the thing you did not expect, to address the question you did not ask, to show up in the form of a question instead of an answer, to arrive as comfort when you came for direction, to arrive as direction when you came for comfort. The living God does not fit inside a listening practice. The listening practice simply removes enough of the noise that you can perceive the reality that was always there. And that reality is wildly, beautifully, consistently alive in ways that exceed every expectation you bring to it, which is exactly why it is worth every second of the stillness it requires. If this teaching has stirred something real inside you, I want you to do two things right now. First, write in the comments, I am ready to listen. Let that declaration echo in this space among everyone who is watching, everyone who is hungry, everyone who is returning to the ancient practices together. Second, share this video with someone you know who is in the cave right now, someone who is after the fire and still waiting for the voice. Your sharing this could be the angel that touches them while they sleep and says, get up. Because the journey requires something more than what exhaustion alone can offer you. And before I close, I want to leave you with a blessing drawn from the ancient posture of the people who heard. May the frequency of the living God find the interior you have begun today to prepare. May the Haggah, the sacred murmuring of truth, move through you so deeply and so continuously that the voice becomes as natural to you as breathing. May you find your cave, your sacred position, your 10 minutes of radical stillness, and may the wind and the earthquake and the fire pass over you and leave behind only the voice The still, small, personal, intimate voice that calls your name the way God called to Samuel in the dark. With patience, with persistence, with love that does not quit because you took longer than expected to realize who was calling. Go and listen well. The voice has been waiting for you.